And today we've got a fascinating collection looking at human behavior, but through a biological lens.
Yeah, looking under the hood, so to speak.
Our mission really is to navigate all this complexity, why we do the things we do, our best actions, our worst actions, using biology as our guide.
And hopefully uncover some surprising connections and, those aha moments for you. It's like getting a biological cheat sheet to ourselves.
Exactly. Understanding the basic machinery, what we share with other animals, and, crucially, what makes us uniquely human.
Hmm.
Okay, let's dive right in. The foundational idea, maybe the starting point, is that humans are animals.
Right. It sounds obvious, but we forget. We're apes. We're primates, mammals.
And the sources really hammer this home with some great examples, like the hormones we release when we're scared. A fish under stress pumps out the same stuff.
It's incredible, isn't it? Or think about pleasure. The brain chemicals
Yeah.
involved. Basically the same ones lighting up when a capybara, enjoys a nice bath.
A happy capybara.
Or even just how our neurons fire. Fundamentally similar to, like a brine shrimp.
Wow. That really grounds us in biology. And it even extends to social stuff, like the Wellesley effect in rats. Female cycle synchronizing.
Yeah, and there's some, well, let's say suggestive research in humans too. Not totally conclusive, but hints that women living together might experience something similar. It shows how our biology responds to our social environment, just like other mammals.
And the flip side, things like violence, we see that in other apes too, right? Using tools, even lethal aggression. It's not just a human thing.
Definitely not. It's part of that shared heritage.
So that's the animal foundation. But then what makes us different? This seems to be where it gets tricky, even just defining the terms we use.
Oh, absolutely. Words like aggression, compassion, empathy.
Yeah.
They feel simple, but the sources point out they're loaded with ideological baggage. Our own values really shape how we define them.
Yeah, like competition. That could be a friendly game or something much darker. The biology might be totally different depending on the context.
Exactly. So that objective biological analysis is tough from the start. We have to be aware of the language itself.
Okay, good point. So keeping that in mind, let's move into the brain. The emotional core, the limbic system. There was some early debate about its main job, something about smell.
Yeah, the rhinencephalon, which is basically the limbic system, was initially thought to be all about olfaction, about smell. And for many animals, like rodents, that's largely true. Their emotional world is heavily tied to scent cues.
Right, makes sense for a rat, but for us primates, it's different.
It shifts, yeah. Vision becomes much more central for processing emotional information in primates. Smell still matters, of course, but vision takes a lead role.
But the core idea holds the limbic system. With parts like the amygdala, hippocampus, septum is central to our emotions, which then drive behavior.
Absolutely. That's well established now.
And bridging that emotional hub with our thinking brain is the frontal cortex, the command center.
Exactly. And here's a cool bit of history. Walanada, back in the 60s, proposed that the frontal cortex is so tightly connected to the limbic system, it's almost like a quasi-member of
The
it.
quasi-member, so not totally separate.
Yeah, and that was radical then. The frontal cortex was seen as this purely rational, logical thing, almost above getting mixed up with messy emotions.
Funny how we saw it then. Now we know it's all deeply interconnected.
Totally. It's a much more integrated picture now. Okay, so let's zoom in on one key limbic player, the amygdala, often called the threat detector.
And the evidence seems strong, especially with recognizing angry faces.
Yes, spot on. People with specific amygdala damage, like in Urbach-Wiethe disease, really struggle to identify angry expressions. Other emotions, mostly fine. It shows a specialized role for the amygdala in picking up on those particular social danger cues.
The sources also mention, kind of disturbingly, amygdalotomies, surgery to control aggression.
Yeah, that happened mainly in the 70s. Hugely controversial, obviously. It really highlights the ethical minefield you step into when you talk about altering the brain to change behavior. A very drastic measure.
Definitely. Okay, so threat detection is key. But the amygdala also learns fear associations, right? Ledoux's work comes up here.
Ledoux's research is classic. Pair a neutral sound with a mild shock. Initially, neurons in the basolateral amygdala, the BLA, respond to the sound, but no fear.
Just registers the sound.
Right. But after pairing them, those BLA neurons learn the association. They start activating the central amygdala, which then triggers the actual fear response, the racing heart, the freezing.
And it's not just reacting to the sound wave itself, it's reacting to the meaning that the sound predicts the shock.
Precisely. It's the learned significance. And get this, you can electrically stimulate those BLA neurons to make fear conditioning happen easier. Or even create a false fear, stimulate the auditory pathway while shocking, without the actual sound, and the animal learns to fear a sound it never really heard during the shock.
Whoa, like implanting a fear memory shows how powerful that system is. And it needs to be fast, right? These shortcuts the amygdala takes.
Yes. When speed is critical, like jump out of the way, now the amygdala can bypass the slower, more thoughtful frontal cortex and talk directly to motor pathways. Super fast, reflexive action.
But the trade-off is accuracy.
Exactly. That fast pathway might misinterpret something harmless, like reaching for your phone when startled as a threat. You react before you fully process. Think of tragically mistaken shootings.
Speed versus accuracy, a fundamental tension. And ultimately, the amygdala kicks off a whole body alert.
It does. Signals go to the BNST, the bed nucleus of the strugio terminalis, then the hypothalamus, triggering stress hormones like cortisol. And it also fires up the sympathetic nervous system. Bang. You get the increased heart rate, blood pressure, alertness, ready for action.
Okay, so that's the fast, sometimes flawed threat system. Now, back to the frontal cortex, the thinking part. What's this cognitive load idea?
Right. Cognitive load is basically how much mental effort your working memory is using. When your frontal cortex is really busy complex problem solving, intense social navigation, hard decisions, it has fewer resources left for other tasks that also need the frontal cortex, at least for a while.
Like it gets temporarily drained?
Kind of, yeah.
Interesting.
Multitasking is a classic example. Your prefrontal neurons are juggling multiple circuits at once. There's a limit.
And this overload can actually make us less nice.
It's surprising, isn't it? Studies show when cognitive load is high, people can become less helpful, less charitable, even more likely to lie. And it hits self-regulation too harder to resist cheating on that diet, for instance.
So being mentally taxed can actually reduce our capacity for pro-social behavior and self-control.
That's quite something. Okay, shifting gears to dopamine, often called the pleasure chemical, but it's more complex.
Much more. It's definitely involved in reward, but it's really more about the anticipation of reward, the wanting, the motivation. The classic monkey studies show this beautifully. Train a monkey to press a lever after a light comes on to get juice.
Okay.
Once they learn it, the big dopamine surge isn't when they get the juice, it's right when the light comes on, in anticipation.
So it's the get ready, reward is coming signal.
Exactly. And it fuels the goal-directed behavior you need to get that reward. It connects the value of the reward to the work needed. Those dopamine projections to the prefrontal cortex are crucial for this motivation, especially for long-term goals.
So it helps us stick with things. And there's a difference in how our brain handles immediate versus delayed rewards. Yes. Thinking about an immediate treat tends to light up the limbic dopamine targets, more about instant gratification. But contemplating a bigger reward down the road, that activates the frontal cortical dopamine pathways more.
And the stronger that frontal activation,
The better you are at delaying gratification, resisting the small, immediate thing for the bigger future payoff. It's like the biological basis of willpower.
Fascinating. And stress can dampen this system. Connects to depression, maybe.
It seems so. Stress signals, often via the amygdala, can inhibit dopamine release in these pathways, potentially contributing to that lack of motivation and pleasure, that anhedonia you see in depression and anxiety. Shows how interconnected it all is.
Definitely. Okay, what about serotonin? Usually linked to mood, but here the focus is impulsivity.
Yeah. The link seems strongest with impulsive aggression, acting out without thinking rather than planned, premeditated violence. Low serotonin is also linked to cognitive impulsivity, like choosing small, immediate rewards over larger, delayed ones, or struggling to stop automatic responses.
And maybe impulsive suicide attempts, too.
There's a correlation there, yes. It's about difficulty inhibiting urges. And studies back this up. Artificially lowering serotonin in people or animals increases impulsivity. Raising it, though, seems to mainly help those who are already impulsive to begin with.
So it's not a simple aggression switch, more like a brake on impulsivity.
That's a good way to put it. It modulates our control over immediate urges.
And all these brain chemicals and regions, the sources emphasize the brain is the final common pathway, not the ultimate origin point.
Crucial distinction. Genes, learning, hormones, culture, the immediate situation, all these things converge in the brain to produce behavior. Is where everything gets processed and translated into action.
Which leads us perfectly to sensory triggers. The brain isn't isolated, it's constantly getting input from the outside world.
Constantly. Sight, sounds, smells, touch. All sorts of sensory info can activate brain circuits and nudge our behavior. And, other animals have sensory worlds totally alien to us, detecting magnetic fields or ultraviolet light.
Right, which is where ethology comes in. Understanding behavior means understanding their sensory reality.
Exactly. But even for us, there's stuff hitting our senses that we're not consciously aware of subliminal influences. And this is where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit unsettling.
Like the studies on race perception, flashing a face from a different race subliminally.
Yeah, in white participants, you see a superfast amygdala blip, like an initial alert. But if the face is shown longer, consciously perceived, then the frontal cortex kicks in, potentially regulating that initial response. Shows that automatic reaction versus controlled processing.
And it affects face recognition itself, the fusiform face area.
It does. Reduced activity in the fusiform area for other race faces, especially in people with higher implicit bias. It's not just about novelty. The brain's distinguishing based on the social category, unconsciously.
Which has scary implications for threat perception, like in that armed and armed study.
That's a really stark one. Using ERP's brainwave measurements, they found white subjects showed a bigger initial threat signal, the P200, to black faces, armed or unarmed. Very fast, like 200 milliseconds.
Just an automatic threat tag.
Seems like it.
Mm.
And then a later brainwave, the N200, linked to inhibiting responses, was weaker for black faces compared to white faces.
And that combination, stronger threat, weaker inhibition.
Correlated with being more likely to mistakenly shoot an unarmed black person in the simulation. It suggests these rapid unconscious biases can have lethal consequences.
Wow. And subliminally, seeing black faces could even make people better at spotting weapons later.
Yeah, like it primes the system for threat detection. It's complex. And it's not just race. Beauty has subliminal effects, too.
Right. We tend to judge attractive people more positively across the board. Smarter, kinder.
Yep. Unfair, but true. We vote for the more, give lighter sentences. And interestingly, the medial orbitofrontal cortex, part of the frontal lobe, seems involved in judging both facial beauty and perceived moral goodness. Activity in one predicts activity in the other.
Like our brain unconsciously links pretty with good. So much happening below the surface. Okay, let's shift to hormones, chemical messengers acting over longer periods, hours to days.
Right, modulating brain sensitivity. Testosterone is the obvious one for behavior, especially aggression. But the sources say the simple testosterone causes aggression idea is wrong.
It's more nuanced.
Much more. In humans, testosterone doesn't just ramp up aggression generally. It seems to boost the amygdala's response specifically to threatening social cues, like angry faces. And it doesn't make people inherently selfish, but it can increase retaliation if someone feels provoked, that reactive aggression.
So it amplifies responses to threats or provocations rather than just causing aggression out of the blue.
That seems to be the picture. Neurobiologically, it might work by shortening the refractory period, the reset time for neurons in the amygdala and hypothalamus, so they can fire again more quickly in response to a stimulus that's already there, like that angry face. It's turning up the volume on existing signals.
Okay, that's a key clarification. And then there's oxytocin, the bonding hormone, but again, context matters.
Hugely. Yes, it's vital for maternal bonding in mammals. Giving it to virgin rats can make them mother pups. Blocking it stops moms from carrying.
Right.
It helps moms learn their baby scent. But its effects on general prosociality are very dependent on who you're interacting with and the situation. It's not just a universal make nice hormone.
Biology is rarely simple answers, is it? Okay, what about sustained stress? We know acute stress primes us for action, but what does chronic stress do?
It really messes with our judgment, particularly risk assessment. Under chronic stress, people can become irrationally risky or irrationally risk-averse because the brain struggles to properly weigh new information.
So our decision-making gets skewed.
Yeah. And neurobiologically, you see changes. The amygdala might process things faster but less accurately. The hippocampus, important for context and memory, can get sort of sidelined, letting the more reactive amygdala dominate. Frontal cortex function gets disrupted too. More fear, anxiety, fuzzy thinking, bad risk assessment, and falling back on impulsive habits. And like testosterone, stress doesn't make someone aggressive, but it can lower the threshold for aggression in response to triggers, especially in people already prone to it.
A really detrimental cycle. But the good news is brains aren't fixed. Neuroplasticity, the ability to change.
Thank goodness for that, yes. LTP and LTD, long-term potentiation and depression, are the basic tools. LTP strengthens connections between neurons that fire together. LTD weakens them. This is how we learn fear conditioning in the amygdala, the frontal cortex learning to regulate the amygdala, dopamine systems linking cues to rewards and addiction. It's all LTP-LTD.
And stress affects this too, that inverted U.
Exactly. Moderate short-term stress can actually boost LTP in the hippocampus, helping memory. But chronic prolonged stress, it disrupts LTP and promotes LTD, contributing to cognitive problems. A little stress good, too much bad.
And the brain physically changes. New connections.
Oh. Yeah. Learning a new motor skill, getting more visual stimulation, even just rats exploring with their whiskers. You see new synapses forming, dendritic trees branching out to make more connections. The brain reshapes itself based on experience.
But it's not always positive and it has limits.
Crucially, yes, plasticity is value-free. Taxi drivers develop larger hippocampi that's adaptive. But someone with PTSD might have an enlarged amygdala and shrunken hippocampus that's maladaptive plasticity. And while plasticity continues throughout life, it generally becomes less dramatic as we age.
Okay, let's talk about a time of intense plasticity and change. Adolescence.
A really critical period.
Yeah.
And probably the single biggest factor is the delayed maturation of the frontal cortex. The emotional systems, hormonal systems, they're pretty much online, full throttle.
But the brakes, the frontal cortex, are still under construction.
Pretty much. Which helps explain a lot of typical teenage behavior. The impulsivity, risk-taking, novelty-seeking, the huge focus on peers, the emotional roller coasters.
It's driven by that imbalance, and it's not that they have more brain cells up front.
No, counterintuitively, adolescence involves significant pruning of synapses in the frontal cortex. It's like neural Darwinism overproduced connections early on, then weed out the less efficient ones to optimize the circuits. It's refinement, not just growth.
And hormones and other brain areas influence this.
Definitely. Reward pathways like the ventral striatum are highly active, making social rewards and thrilling experiences extra appealing. And puberty hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, have major organizing effects on the developing brain, including the frontal cortex. When milestones happen is often tied more to puberty onset than just chronological age.
So it's a massive rewiring phase. How does this affect their thinking, like understanding others or morality?
They get much better at perspective taking than children, but they're still generally better at seeing things from their own perspective than easily grasping a third-person view compared to adults. And morally, they shift from a kid's simple, everyone gets the same fairness, to a more meritocratic view rewarding effort. But it's often less complex than adult meritocracy, maybe not fully grasping systemic factors versus individual effort yet.
And this developmental stage links to behavior patterns like violence.
Yeah, sadly, rates of violence, both impulsive and premeditated, tend to peak in late adolescence and early adulthood, then decline. Someone famously said the greatest crime-fighting tool is a 30th birthday.
By the peak, then?
It's likely a convergence of factors. That heightened emotional intensity, the drive for peer approval, novelty-seeking, risk-taking, all combined with the still-developing impulse control and long-term consequence evaluation of the frontal cortex.
It's a vulnerable period, and experiences during childhood can cast a long shadow, right? Adversity.
Absolutely. Childhood adversity, abuse, neglect, trauma, instability significantly increases the risk for a whole host of problems later. Depression, anxiety, substance abuse, poorer cognitive function, impaired impulse control and emotion regulation, antisocial behavior, violence, and difficulty forming healthy relationships.
Are there caveats? Like, does watching violent media cause violence?
The evidence suggests the effects of media violence are strongest on kids already prone to aggression. For them, it can lead to desensitization, normalizing violence, but it's not a simple cause-effect for everyone, and being bullied is another form of adversity with impacts comparable to maltreatment at home.
So early environments profoundly shape the developing brain and later behavior, even before birth, prenatal influences.
Yes, definitely. Hormones in the womb play a big role. Take congenital adrenal hyperplasia, CAH. Genetic females are exposed to unusually high levels of androgens, male hormones, before birth. Even if hormone levels are normalized after birth, they often show more male-typical behaviors like toy preferences, suggest that prenatal hormones organize the brain differently.
And the reverse, androgen insensitivity syndrome.
Right, AIS. Genetic males whose bodies can't respond to testosterone due to a receptor mutation. They often develop female external anatomy and typically identify and behave as a female. It really underscores how crucial that prenatal testosterone bath is for masculinizing the brain and body.
So biology isn't just postnatal. Genes obviously play a role too, but it's not deterministic.
Not at all. Genes provide blueprints and predispositions, but they don't dictate outcomes in a simple way. Plus, there's even genetic variation within an individual's brain cells due to things like transposons jumping genes. It's complicated.
How do scientists study the genetic contribution, behavior genetics?
That's the main approach. It's sort of top-down, looking at traits and relatives. Twin studies are classic. If a trait was purely genetic, identical twins should be 100% concordant, right? But for something like schizophrenia, concordance is less than 50%, showing environment plays a huge role.
And heritability, that number you often hear, what does that really mean?
It's tricky. It's not how much of a trait is inherited. It's about how much of the variation in a trait within a specific population can be accounted for by genetic differences in that population's environment. Many behavioral traits show heritability around 40–60%.
But that number can change.
Massively.
Yeah.
Methods often inflate it anyway. But think about height. In identical environments, height differences might be 100% genetic. But across different environments with varying nutrition, heritability will be lower because environment explains more of the difference.
Genes and environment interact. It's not just additive.
Exactly. Gene-environment interaction means the effect of a gene depends on the environment, and the effect of the environment depends on the gene. It's that classic, it depends.
Any examples?
Sure. One study found a variant of the FADS2 gene only boosted IQ points in children who were breastfed. No breastfeeding, no IQ boost from that gene variant. Or a mouse studied identical mouse strains, identical conditions, but raised in 3 different top labs. Result: gene effects on behavior varied significantly by lab. Some tiny, unidentified environmental difference completely changed how the genes express themselves behaviorally.
Wow. So environment can be incredibly subtle. Which brings us to culture, a huge environmental factor.
Massive.
Yeah.
Culture shapes us from day one, what we value, what's moral, what success looks like, but it goes deeper. Culture can influence how we literally see things, where we focus our eyes in pictures, how we categorize objects. Do monkeys go with bananas because they eat them, or with pandas because they're both animals? Even how we intuitively understand physics can vary culturally.
But we need to be careful with the generalizations, like collectivist versus individualist.
Absolutely. These are broad tendencies. On average, there's huge variation within any culture.
Is there evidence linking specific cultural practices to ways of thinking?
Yes, a fascinating study in Turkey looked at communities in the same region. Same language, religion, genes, but different livelihoods. Farming, fishing, herding. Farmers and fishermen, who rely more on coordinating with others, tended towards more holistic thinking, seeing context in relationships. Herders, working more independently, lean towards analytical thinking, focusing on objects and categories. Social interdependence seems to foster holistic thought.
That's amazing. Culture shaping cognition at that level. What about something like the culture of honor in the U.S. South?
Linked historically to Scotch-Irish herding traditions, where reputation was vital to protect livestock, and maybe later reinforced by the need to control enslaved populations. It involves hypersensitivity to insults, threats to reputation both external and internal, and can, in extreme cases, manifest in violence to defend honor.
And culture influences religion, too.
Strong patterns emerge. Desert cultures, often monotheistic. Rainforests, more polytheistic. Pastoral nomads, often value war gods. Agriculturalists invent weather gods. And moralizing, punishing gods tend to arise in large anonymous societies where reputation alone isn't enough to enforce cooperation. Threat levels, inequality, even infant mortality rates correlate with religious orthodoxy.
Culture is incredibly powerful, and this all rests on the foundation of evolution, right? Nothing in biology makes sense.
Except in the light of evolution.
Exactly. Evolution provides the ultimate why, the 3 basic steps. Inheritance of traits, variation through mutation and recombination, and natural selection favoring traits that enhance survival and reproduction in a given environment.
And this applies to behavior, too. Sociobiology, evolutionary psychology.
Yep, those fields study how social behaviors and psychological traits might have evolved because they were adaptive for our ancestors.
Like mating strategies, pair bonding versus tournament species. Classic example. Look across primates. In pair-bonded species, males often invest heavily in parenting. They're choosy about mates. There's less variation in male reproductive success, smaller tests, less male-male aggression, less size difference between sexes. Females might look for good dad qualities.
And tournament species.
The opposite. Males compete intensely, little parental care, huge variation in reproductive success. A few males get most matings. Large tests for sperm competition, lots of male aggression, big size differences. Females often choose based on good genes indicators. These trait clusters make sense evolutionarily.
Where do humans fit?
We're complicated, kind of in between. Most cultures allow polygyny, but most people globally practice social monogamy. Our sexual dimorphism and testes size are intermediate. We have some imprinted genes where expression depends on whether it came from mom or dad, reflecting genetic conflict between sexes, but fewer than extreme tournament species.
And evolution helps explain some darker human tendencies.
Well, the drive for males to maximize reproductive success is certainly invoked to explain a lot of male violence. But humans also do things that defy simple reproductive logic: celibacy, sacrificing for unrelated strangers.
What about altruism? Kin selection?
Helping relatives makes evolutionary sense. You're helping copies of your genes. But humans deviate significantly. We help non-relatives extensively and seem to rely more on recognizing kin cognitively than innate cues. Reciprocal altruism, helping others with the expectation of return, is huge for us. Hunter-gatherer bands often aren't just close kin. Cooperation extends widely.
So not just helping family.
No. And there's indirect reciprocity, too. I help you, you help someone else helps me. Reputation matters. And warfare probably emerged later, maybe after agriculture and owning resources became significant.
So biology provides the potential, evolution shapes tendencies, but culture massively molds how it plays out.
Exactly. Brains shape culture. Culture shapes brain. It's coevolution. Our long childhood and that slowly developing frontal cortex are crucial for soaking up complex cultural rules, not just how to walk, but when it's okay to punch someone, who to share with, what to believe.
And a fundamental part of that cultural learning involves dividing the world into us and them.
Oh, profoundly. And our brains do it incredibly fast. That amygdala activation to other race faces happens within like 50 milliseconds. Fusiform face area activity changes within a few hundred milliseconds. We categorize by gender, status, almost instantly and unconsciously.
And these categories aren't fixed. They can be manipulated.
Easily. Priming studies show you can subtly nudge people's attitudes. Prime loyalty, and they might favor an US. Prime equality, and they might lean towards fairness for them. Even subliminal cues work. Pair positive expressions with info about a fictional country, Moldova, and people feel warmer towards Moldovans. Pair negative expressions with info about, say, Mexican immigrants, attitudes worsen, support for exclusion increases, but only towards that specific group.
Hormones play a role, too. Ovulation.
There's evidence for that. One study found white women, when ovulating, showed more negative implicit attitudes towards African-American men. Suggests hormonal shifts can modulate the intensity of this us-them distinction.
But humans are unique in how we do us-theming.
Very much so. We belong to multiple use groups, simultaneously: family, nation, sports team, profession, and their important shifts. We have complex ideas about different thems. Crucially, we can feel bad about our biases, try to hide them, and cultures develop mechanisms to sharpen or soften these divisions.
Like stereotypes. The stereotype content model.
Yeah, that model categorizes groups based on perceived warmth and competence. High is use, allies. Low often evokes disgust, homeless, addicts. High warmth, low competence evokes pity, elderly, disabled. And low warmth, high competence evokes envy, often minority groups perceived as successful, like Asians or Jews in some contexts. Each combination triggers different emotions and behaviors.
And hierarchy makes this worse.
Steeper hierarchies definitely exacerbate them. Those at the top often use stereotypes like poor but happy, high warmth, low competence, or dangerous and lazy, low warmth, low competence, to justify the status quo. Those at the bottom tend to see the powerful as competent but cold, low warmth, high competence. These beliefs help maintain inequality.
So hierarchy is deeply intertwined with us-them psychology. We see hierarchies in other animals, too.
We do. Similarities in stability, how group size relates to cortex size, Dunbar's number, predicting social group limits. And the physiological consequences of rank are striking. Low-ranking baboons show chronically elevated stress hormones, sluggish recovery from stress mirroring learned helplessness or depression in humans.
But the meaning of rank matters. It's not always stressful to be low.
Exactly. It depends on the group's social dynamics, stability, and, importantly, the individual's personality and perception. And speaking of perception, attribution style differs. Liberals seem more inclined to look for situational explanations for behavior. Conservatives, perhaps, more towards dispositional ones. Suggests maybe liberals experience more conflict when making snap judgments based on stereotypes.
Fascinating. Okay, related to hierarchy in groups is conformity and obedience. Following the crowd, following orders.
Universal human tendencies, from obeying traffic laws to participating in atrocities because everyone else was doing it, or I was just following orders.
Roots in other animals.
Deep roots. Social learning is widespread in primates. Animals copy behaviors they see others doing frequently. Chimps have cultural traditions passed down. Even emotional contagion yawning, aggression spreading through a group.
What happens in the brain when we conform or resist?
Neuroimaging suggests resisting group pressure involves activity in the VMPFC, part of the frontal cortex linked to value and emotion regulation. Conforming, sometimes even revising your memory to match the group, activates areas like the hippocampus and visual cortex.
What makes people less likely to obey harmful orders?
Factors like the perceived legitimacy and proximity of the authority figure matter. How much you identify with the group giving the orders, whether you see others resisting, the perceived prestige of the authority.
And those who do resist, are they extraordinary?
Often, no. That's the banality of heroism. People who do the right thing in difficult circumstances often seem surprisingly ordinary beforehand, which is maybe hopeful. It suggests we all have that potential.
That leads us to morality itself, our sense of right and wrong.
Defined generally as shared, culturally transmitted beliefs about appropriate behavior. A big debate is whether moral decisions are driven primarily by rational reasoning or by gut feelings, moral intuitions.
Probably both.
Likely a mix. Human morality probably has deep evolutionary roots shared with primates, but also relies heavily on recent cultural institutions. But often our reactions are instantaneous. Brain areas associated with emotion amygdala, VMPFC, insula, tend to light up before the more cognitive DLPFC when people face moral dilemmas.
So intuition often comes first, and damage to those intuition areas.
Can lead to more logical, sometimes cold decisions. Like people with VMPFC damage, being more willing to sacrifice one person to save 5 in trolley problems, without the usual emotional aversion.
Even monkeys have a sense of fairness.
The famous capuchin monkey study. One gets a cucumber, the other gets a much better grape for the same task. The cucumber monkey gets outraged, throws the cucumber back. Shows a basic aversion to inequity, seen in other species too. Emotion and intuition seem to anchor some core moral judgments.
But reasoning plays a role too.
Of course. Deciding whether to join a protest involves both gut feelings about injustice and reasoned calculation of risks and benefits. Across cultures, people in economic games are more cooperative and willing to punish unfairness than pure, rational self-interest would predict.
So a dual process. Intuition for simple you versus me situations, maybe, but reasoning needed for complex them scenarios.
That fits the evidence. Studies show that forcing people to decide quickly or priming intuition leads to more cooperation in games. Instructing careful thought or priming reflection can actually decrease cooperation. Our intuitive default might be more pro-social than we think, at least within our U.S. group.
Closely related to morality is empathy feeling with someone else.
Defined as feeling an aversive state mirroring another's pain, fear, or sadness. It exists on a continuum across species. Compassion is when that empathy motivates help and behavior.
And true empathy is internally driven, not just guilt.
Ideally, yes. Brain scans show different patterns when helping is driven by genuine empathy versus feeling obligated or wanting reciprocity. Both cognitive understanding and feeling the emotion are involved. The anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, is central. It activates both when we feel pain and when we see someone else in pain.
Why would the ACC do that?
Oxytocin promotes bonding and trust, and it acts on the ACC in voles when they console a distressed partner. One theory is empathy piggybacks on the ACC's role in self-interest, learning from others' misfortunes. Ooh, I should avoid doing that. Shared self-representation, I wouldn't like feeling that. Bridges seeing their pain and feeling it ourselves.
What about mirror neurons? Don't they explain empathy?
That theory's been debated. Mirror neurons fire when we perform an action and when we see someone else perform it. They might help us understand actions, but whether they directly cause empathy is unclear. We can understand actions we can't perform, for example. So maybe a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole story.
And altruism isn't always pure. Reputation matters.
Oh, definitely. Being seen as generous has social rewards. Charitable acts activate dopamine reward circuits more strongly when a reputation is at stake. And there's moral licensing. Doing a good deed can make us feel licensed to be less helpful later. Weirdly, physically washing your hands can reduce this effect.
Washing away the license, that relates to confusing literal and metaphorical sensations.
Exactly. Like the study where holding a heavy clipboard made people judge a job applicant as more serious or weighty. Or feeling physically cold makes us perceive someone as emotionally colder. Thinking about lying makes people want mouthwash. Heartache feels physically painful.
Why do we do that?
Our brains are evolutionary tinkerers. We didn't evolve brand new brain regions for abstract concepts like moral disgust overnight. Instead, circuits originally for literal physical disgust, like the insular processing rotten food, got co-opted to handle metaphorical disgust, like towards immoral actions.
And this confusion matters.
Critically, especially in use-em conflicts. If you can make people feel literally disgusted by a them group using metaphors of disease or filth, you engage the insula, making them seem less human, easier to harm.
Which ties into sacred values, things people won't compromise on.
Yes, conflicts aren't just about practical issues. They often involve deeply held, non-negotiable moral beliefs, sacred values. Lasting peace often requires acknowledging and respecting the other side's sacred values, not just negotiating practicalities. Think of Rabin and Arafat's handshake, or the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. Finding common ground around, or at least respecting, those core beliefs is key.
This all raises huge questions about free will and responsibility, if our biology influences us so much.
It's a massive philosophical and legal tangle. Most people operate with a sense of mitigated free will. We have intentions, but biology can sometimes get in the way.
Like the legal standard, the Emnaten rule.
Sort of a legal framing of that, yeah. From 1842, it asks if a disease of the mind prevented someone from understanding their actions or knowing they were wrong. It acknowledges biology can impair the capacity for rational choice. We intuitively adjust blame based on what we think someone should be capable of controlling.
Age is a factor, too. The Supreme Court on juvenile offenders.
Right. Roper v. Simmons banned the death penalty for crimes committed under 18, citing the still developing frontal cortex and its role in judgment and impulse control. Biology influencing legal culpability.
And incredibly difficult cases, like understanding the neurobiology of something like pedophilia.
Extremely complex and sensitive. Understanding potential biological predispositions doesn't automatically excuse behavior or dictate whether someone deserves sympathy, but it complicates simple notions of blame and choice. It forces us to confront the limits of willpower when biology is strongly skewed.
So, navigating all this complexity, how do we move towards a better world? Is violence declining, like Pinker argues?
Pinker makes a case, using population-adjusted data, that past eras were even bloodier, despite the horrors of the 20th century. But critics point to Eurocentrism and other issues. It's debated. But we do see links between things like moralizing religions and cooperation in large, anonymous societies.
Does just bringing groups together help? Intergroup contact?
Sometimes, but not always. It can backfire if there's inequality, competition, or conflict over those sacred values we talked about. The conditions have to be right.
How did cooperation evolve among non-relatives in the first place?
Kin selection helps in small founder groups. Maybe Greenbeard affects genes that cause a trait and recognition of that trait in others, but uniquely human things are crucial. Sophisticated tit-for-tat reciprocity, punishing those who don't cooperate, and even punishing those who don't punish. Sharing costs through things like taxes. We build systems to foster cooperation.
Can societies reconcile after terrible conflict?
Examples like South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission suggest it's possible at a societal level. It focused on establishing truth and enabling national function, not necessarily demanding individual forgiveness or remorse from everyone.
So what's the takeaway from this whole biological deep dive?
Maybe that understanding our own biases, implicit, subliminal, unconscious, and our sometimes irrational optimism is key. Knowing how our brains work, warts and all, is the first step.
And realizing our biology isn't just the source of our worst behaviors.
Exactly. It's also the source of our best empathy, compassion, cooperation, love. And history shows that seemingly ordinary people are capable of extraordinary good, often by overcoming those very biological tendencies towards us-them thinking or blind obedience. The potential is there.
It's been a truly fascinating journey through the biology of us. We've covered so much ground, from single neurons firing to complex cultural evolution.
The sheer number of interacting factors is mind-boggling, isn't it? Hormones hours before, brain development years before, genes centuries before, evolution millennia before, all playing out in a single behavior.
Some real standouts for me were how dopamine drives anticipation, not just pleasure, how testosterone subtly tunes threat response, and the power of those unconscious subliminal cues. It really makes you question how much conscious control we actually have sometimes.
It does. It encourages a bit more humility, perhaps. Understanding these biological underpinnings isn't about making excuses, but about gaining a more realistic understanding of the challenges and potentials inherent in being human.
So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. Perhaps the hardest part of being human isn't just battling our base instincts, but recognizing and maybe trying to mitigate the constant, subtle push and pull of our hidden biology and ingrained culture on our judgments, even when we truly believe we're acting rationally and with the best intentions. Something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on the Dim Dive.